Welcome back to History for Hours. Tonight, we step into the quieter streets of Philadelphia, where power didn't shout, it whispered, and respect was earned through patience rather than chaos. This is the world of Philip Testa, a man known for restraint, where influence moved behind closed doors, decisions were slow and deliberate, and silence often carried more weight than threats. Most people couldn't survive a life like this, not because it was loud or reckless, but because it demanded discipline, loyalty, and the ability to sit calmly at the center of constant tension. Before we settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Only if you genuinely enjoy these long, slow journeys through history's darker corners. And if you're listening right now, drop a comment with your location and local time. I love knowing where these stories travel. Now dim the lights, let the city noise fade, and settle in as we ease into the measured, watchful story of Philip Testa. The night had a way of settling softly over South Philadelphia, like a blanket pulled up just enough to quiet the noise but not the thoughts. Streetlights hummed, row houses breathed out the day's warmth, and somewhere in the distance a train rolled by, steady and unhurried. Philip Testa liked this hour. It was the time when the city stopped asking questions and simply existed. Sitting near a window with the lights low, he listened to the familiar sounds and let memory do what it always did, drift backward. He hadn't set out to be anyone important. That was the truth of it. Growing up in a tight-knit Italian neighborhood, Philip learned early that survival wasn't about standing out. It was about fitting in. Respect was earned slowly, through consistency, through showing up when expected and keeping your word when it mattered. The men he watched as a boy weren't loud or flashy. They spoke softly, listened more than they talked, and seemed to know things before others did. Philip absorbed those lessons without realizing it, storing them away like tools he might one day need. As a young man, he worked hard and kept his head down. He understood the value of patience in a city where impatience often led to trouble. People began to notice him not because he demanded attention, but because he was reliable. If Philip said he would handle something, it got handled. If he promised discretion, silence followed. In neighborhoods where trust was fragile and reputations traveled fast, that kind of consistency mattered more than charm or bravado. Over time, he became someone others sought out for advice. Not because he pretended to have all the answers, but because he asked the right questions. Philip had a way of making people feel heard, of giving them space to explain themselves. He noticed pauses in conversation, the way someone's eyes shifted when they were uncertain, the subtle tells that revealed more than words ever could. This attentiveness became his strength, allowing him to navigate complex relationships without drawing unnecessary attention. Family remained at the center of his world. Sunday dinners, long conversations, shared traditions. These were not formalities, they were anchors. Philip believed that a man's true measure was how he treated those closest to him. Loyalty, in his view, wasn't blind obedience. It was mutual understanding, built over time and tested by circumstance. He carried these values into every aspect of his life, shaping how he dealt with friends, associates, and rivals alike. As the years passed, responsibility found him whether he sought it or not. People began to look to Philip for stability, for guidance during uncertain times. He accepted this role quietly, aware that leadership didn't require announcements. It required judgment. He learned to weigh decisions carefully, considering not just immediate outcomes but long-term consequences. Acting too quickly could undo years of careful work, while waiting, truly waiting, often revealed the best path forward. Philip's reputation grew, but it did so in hushed tones. He was not a man who courted attention, and that suited him just fine. He preferred the background, where observation was easier and pressure less obvious. From there, he could see patterns forming, sense shifts in loyalty or ambition, and adjust accordingly. He understood that influence, when wielded subtly, was far more enduring than force or noise. Evenings like this one, quiet and reflective, reminded him of how far he had come. The city outside was changing, as cities always do, but its core remained familiar. People still wanted security, respect, and a sense of belonging. Philip had learned how to provide those things in his own way, without spectacle or excess. He believed that stability was the greatest gift a leader could offer, especially in a world that often felt unpredictable. He thought about the younger men watching him now, just as he once watched others. He hoped they noticed the right things, not the position but the patience, not the authority but the responsibility. Philip never claimed to be perfect, but he tried to be consistent. He knew mistakes were inevitable, but recklessness was not. Every decision carried weight, and he treated that weight with care. As the night deepened, Philip rose and closed the curtains slightly, letting the room settle into shadow. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, its own conversations and considerations. But for now, there was peace in reflection. He had built his life not on noise, but on understanding. Not on speed, but on timing. And as the city breathed steadily outside, Philip Testa allowed himself a rare moment of stillness, aware that his story, quietly, steadily, was still unfolding. Morning came gently in South Philadelphia, the kind that didn't rush you awake but eased its way in through narrow streets and half-open blinds. Philip Testa was already up before most of the neighborhood stirred. He liked the quiet before the city found its voice. Coffee brewed slowly, the radio murmured low, and Philip sat with his thoughts, thinking not about the day ahead, but about the long road behind him. Responsibility had a way of arriving without invitation. One day you were simply doing your part, and the next people were looking to you for answers. Philip never chased that kind of attention. In fact, he avoided it. But avoidance didn't mean refusal. When others stepped back, he stepped forward. When uncertainty crept into conversations, his calm steadiness filled the space. It wasn't courage in the dramatic sense. It was composure, the kind that came from understanding how fragile balance could be. As his influence grew, so did the complexity of the world around him. Conversations carried more weight. Decisions rippled farther than he sometimes expected. Philip learned quickly that leadership wasn't about issuing directions, but about managing expectations. He listened carefully, spoke sparingly, and made sure that when he did speak, his words were worth hearing. People noticed. They always did. He developed a reputation for fairness, which in his world was rarer than people admitted. Philip didn't favor noise over sense or emotion over logic. He believed that every situation had more than one side, and that understanding all of them was essential before choosing a path. This approach didn't make him popular with everyone, but it earned him something more valuable: credibility. Philadelphia was a city of strong personalities, and navigating them required tact. Philip understood that pride could be as dangerous as impatience. He learned when to let someone feel heard, even if their idea wasn't the right one, and when to quietly redirect a conversation without embarrassing anyone involved. These small social calibrations kept tensions low and trust intact. Over time, people came to appreciate that Philip wasn't interested in dominance. He was interested in stability. Family obligations remained constant. No matter how busy life became, he made time for shared meals and familiar rituals. These moments grounded him. They reminded him why caution mattered, why foresight wasn't optional. He believed that whatever a man built outside his home meant little if he neglected what was inside it. That belief shaped every decision he made, even when others didn't see the connection. As years passed, Philip noticed how the world tested people differently. Some were tested by success, others by disappointment. He watched carefully to see who changed under pressure and who stayed the same. Consistency mattered to him more than talent or ambition. Anyone could talk about loyalty when things were easy. Philip paid attention to behavior when things were uncertain. He also understood the value of staying out of the spotlight. Visibility invited scrutiny, and scrutiny invited problems. Philip preferred to operate just beneath the surface where influence could be, exercised quietly and effectively. He had learned that the loudest voices often faded first, while the steady ones endured. That lesson guided him more than any ambition ever could. There were nights when the weight of it all pressed in on him. Not fear exactly, but awareness. Awareness that every decision affected lives beyond his own. In those moments, He reminded himself of the principles that had carried him this far. Patience, discretion, respect. These weren't abstract ideals. They were practical tools tested over time. The city continued to change, as cities always do. New faces appeared, old ones faded away. Through it all, Philip remained a constant presence, adapting without losing himself. He understood that survival wasn't about resisting change, but about guiding it gently, steering rather than forcing. That mindset allowed him to remain relevant without becoming rigid. As the day unfolded and the streets filled with noise again, Philip stepped back into motion. Conversations awaited him, decisions needed attention, and the balance he worked so hard to maintain required constant care. He didn't rush. He never did, because he knew that the strongest moves were often the quietest ones. And as he walked through the familiar streets of South Philadelphia, Philip Testa carried with him the understanding that his story wasn't written in headlines or grand gestures. It was written in moments of restraint, in careful listening, and in the slow, deliberate building of trust. The kind of story that didn't demand attention, but endured. Night settled over the city like a familiar coat, worn in and comfortable. Streetlights flickered to life, casting long shadows along the sidewalks, and Philip Testa found that evenings were when his thoughts became the clearest. The noise of the day faded, replaced by reflection. This was the hour when plans were considered carefully, not rushed by urgency or interrupted by endless conversations. Philip had always believed that a man's true work happened when no one was watching. During the day, there were meetings, greetings, polite exchanges, and carefully measured words. But at night, when the phone rang less often and the streets quieted down, he could finally examine the direction things were taking. He sat with a notebook sometimes, not to write anything down, but to feel anchored by its presence. It reminded him that everything, no matter how complex, could be broken down into smaller, manageable parts. People often mistook calm for softness. Philip knew better. Calm was discipline. It was choosing not to react immediately, not to raise a voice, not to let emotion steer the wheel. Over the years, he had seen how impatience ruined promising futures. He had watched talented men burn bridges simply because they wanted results too quickly. Philip never understood that way of thinking. Time, to him, was not an enemy. It was leverage. His reputation continued to grow quietly, not because he demanded recognition, but because others spoke for him when he wasn't in the room. That kind of respect couldn't be bought or forced. It had to be earned day after day through consistency. If Philip said he would handle something, it was handled. If he gave his word, it held weight. In a world full of shifting loyalties, that reliability made him stand apart. Younger men began to seek his guidance, though they rarely said it outright. They'd ask indirect questions, test conversations, listen closely to his responses. Philip noticed this and chose his words even more carefully. He understood that influence came with responsibility. A careless suggestion could lead someone down the wrong path. So he spoke in principles rather than instructions. He talked about patience, about thinking 3 steps ahead, about understanding people before judging them. One evening, as rain tapped lightly against the windows, Philip found himself thinking about legacy. Not in the grand sense that people talked about, but in the quieter, more personal way. What would people remember about him when he was no longer around to speak for himself? Would they remember a man who sought balance, or one who simply held power? The difference mattered to him, even if it didn't matter to everyone else. Family gatherings remained his refuge. Around familiar faces, he didn't need to measure every word or calculate every pause. Laughter came easier. Stories flowed more freely. These moments reminded him of who he was before responsibility became so heavy. They also reinforced his belief that everything he did outside those walls should ultimately protect what was inside them. Without that purpose, ambition felt hollow. The city tested him in subtle ways. Challenges didn't always arrive as problems. Sometimes they arrived as opportunities that were just slightly off balance. Philip had learned to recognize those moments. He understood that not every open door was meant to be walked through. Some doors, once opened, couldn't be closed again. So he evaluated situations not just for immediate benefit, but for long-term consequences. This habit saved him more times than he could count. He paid close attention to people's tone, their timing, the way they avoided certain topics or lingered too long on others. These details told him more than direct statements ever could. Philip believed that listening was an underestimated skill. Anyone could talk. Few could truly listen. And fewer still could listen without planning their response while the other person was still speaking. As weeks passed, subtle shifts became noticeable. Alliances changed. Priorities evolved. Philip adapted without drawing attention to the adjustment. He didn't cling to old arrangements out of nostalgia. He believed that flexibility was essential to survival. Rigidity, no matter how principled, often led to unnecessary conflict. And conflict, in his experience, rarely produced clean outcomes. There were moments when he felt the strain, though he rarely showed it. Responsibility had a way of pressing down quietly, accumulating rather than striking all at once. In those moments, Philip returned to routine. A walk through the neighborhood. A familiar café. Simple rituals that reminded him the world still made sense in small, reliable ways. These habits kept him grounded when larger questions felt unresolved. He also became more selective with his time. Not everyone deserved access to his attention, and he had learned that saying less was often more effective than explaining too much. Silence, when used wisely, could speak louder than any speech. Philip used it as a tool, not a shield. He wasn't hiding, he was conserving. Late one night, after a long conversation that carried more implications than words, Philip sat alone and considered the path ahead. He knew that maintaining balance required constant effort. Stability wasn't something you achieved once and then kept forever. It had to be defended gently, daily, through judgment and restraint. The city outside continued its endless rhythm. Cars passed. Distant voices echoed. Somewhere, music played from an open window. Life moved forward, indifferent to individual concerns. Philip found comfort in that. It reminded him that no one was as central as they sometimes believed. That humility kept his ego in check, even as his influence grew. As dawn approached and the sky softened from black to gray, Philip finally allowed himself a moment of rest. Not sleep yet, just stillness. He knew that the next day would bring its own set of challenges, conversations, and decisions. But he also knew he was prepared, not because he controlled everything, but because he understood enough to navigate what he couldn't control. His story, unfolding quietly, continued to be shaped by patience rather than urgency, by listening rather than demanding, and by the steady belief that true strength didn't announce itself. It simply endured. Morning arrived, without ceremony, the kind that slid into the room slowly, light stretching across the walls as if it didn't want to wake anyone too abruptly. Philip Testa noticed these things. He always had. Mornings told you a lot about the day ahead, not through predictions, but through mood. A restless morning meant caution. A quiet one meant space to think. He started his days early, before most of the city shook itself awake. There was something reassuring about being ahead of the rhythm, like stepping onto a stage before the audience arrived. He brewed his coffee the same way every morning, never rushing it. Routine wasn't about stubbornness. It was about control. When enough of life was unpredictable, the smallest constants became anchors. As the hours passed, conversations began to stack up. Calls returned. Messages acknowledged. Philip didn't overwhelm himself by trying to solve everything at once. He categorized problems the way others might organize shelves. Some things needed immediate attention, others could wait, and some would resolve themselves if left alone long enough. Experience had taught him that not every situation benefited from interference. People came to him not just for decisions, but for reassurance. Even when he didn't have all the answers, his presence had a calming effect. He spoke slowly, not because he lacked urgency, but because he believed words should be chosen carefully. Once spoken, they couldn't be taken back. Philip treated language like currency, valuable, finite, and never wasted. He often thought about how leadership wasn't about commanding attention, but about holding it. Anyone could raise their voice. Few could lower it and still be heard. When he entered a room, he didn't try to dominate it. He let the room adjust to him. That subtle shift was something you felt rather than saw, and it came from years of observing human nature in all its contradictions. Afternoons were for movement, not frantic, not aimless, but deliberate. Philip believed momentum was important, even if progress was incremental. He visited familiar places, exchanged nods with people who had known him for decades. These connections weren't superficial. They were built over time, strengthened by shared history and mutual understanding. No introductions were needed, no explanations required. There were moments, though, when he felt the weight of expectations pressing harder than usual. The world he navigated rewarded confidence but punished vulnerability. Philip learned long ago to process doubt privately. He didn't deny it existed. He simply refused to let it dictate his actions. Doubt, when acknowledged properly, could sharpen judgment rather than weaken it. In quieter moments, his thoughts drifted backward, not with regret, but with analysis. He revisited decisions the way a craftsman might inspect old work, looking for flaws, appreciating what held up over time. Some choices still surprised him, not because they were wrong, but because they revealed how much he had changed. Growth wasn't always obvious when you were living through it. As evening approached, the city grew louder, more impatient. Philip adjusted his pace accordingly. He knew when to engage and when to retreat. Not every conversation required participation. Not every disagreement required resolution. There was power in restraint, and he practiced it daily. It wasn't about avoiding responsibility. It was about choosing battles wisely. Dinner was usually simple, nothing elaborate. He believed excess dulled the senses. Conversation, when shared, was unforced. Stories drifted from topic to topic, touching on memories, observations, small absurdities of daily life. Laughter came easily in these moments, reminding him that life didn't always need to be measured and weighed. Later, alone again, Philip returned to reflection. The night had a way of pulling honesty to the surface. He considered the people around him, the loyal ones, the uncertain ones, the ambitious ones. He understood that everyone wanted something, even if they didn't say it out loud. His task wasn't to fulfill every want, but to maintain balance. Too much satisfaction led to complacency. Too much denial led to resentment. He kept his expectations realistic. Perfection was a myth, and chasing it only led to frustration. Instead, he aimed for stability, a steady hand, a clear head. These were the qualities that sustained influence over time. Flashy success faded quickly. Quiet consistency endured. There were nights when sleep came easily, and others when it didn't. On restless nights, Philip listened, to the city, to his own breathing, to the passing of time. He didn't fight wakefulness. He used it. Thoughts lined themselves up, and solutions sometimes appeared without effort. It was during these hours that he understood himself best. He was aware always that the world was changing. New faces, new ideas, new pressures. Philip didn't resist change, but he didn't chase it either. He believed adaptation worked best when guided by principle. Without that foundation, flexibility turned into instability. He watched carefully, learned quietly, and adjusted when necessary. As days blended into weeks, a sense of cautious confidence settled in. Not arrogance, not complacency, just assurance. Philip trusted his instincts not because they were infallible, but because they were informed. Every experience, every mistake, every success had shaped them. Ignoring that inner compass would have felt dishonest. He understood that stories were already being written about him, whether he contributed to them or not. He couldn't control those narratives. What he could control was how he lived each day, with intention, with awareness, with restraint. And so the story continued, not with dramatic turns or loud declarations, but with steady steps forward. Philip Testa moved through his world the way he always had, guided by patience, shaped by observation, and grounded in the belief that the most enduring influence was the kind that didn't need to announce itself. Night had a way of turning the city into a mirror. Philip Testa sat near the window, watching reflections slide across the glass. Passing headlights, neon signs, silhouettes moving with purpose or impatience. At this hour, people were truer versions of themselves. The masks they wore during the day loosened. You could tell who was running from something and who was running toward it. Philip believed listening was an underestimated skill. Not just hearing words, but catching what lived between them. Over the years, he'd learned that silence often carried more information than speech. When people talked too much, they were usually hiding something. When they chose their words carefully, they were revealing more than they realized. This night, his thoughts settled on responsibility. Not the kind people bragged about, but the kind that followed you home and sat with you at the table. Responsibility meant knowing that your decisions rippled outward, touching lives you might never meet. It wasn't something you could shrug off once things got complicated. If anything, complexity made it heavier. He remembered being younger, when confidence came easily because consequences felt far away. Back then, the future seemed flexible, almost forgiving. Time corrected that illusion. The older he grew, the more he understood that every shortcut demanded payment later. Wisdom, he realized, wasn't about avoiding mistakes altogether. It was about recognizing patterns before they repeated. Morning came again, steady and patient. Philip woke with the same quiet discipline he always had.
No alarms blaring, no frantic ruse.
He believed the tone of the morning often set the tone for the day. Calm beginnings led to clearer thinking. He dressed simply, favoring comfort over presentation. He never needed clothes to announce who he was. As he stepped outside, the neighborhood greeted him with familiar sounds. Distant traffic, a shop owner lifting a metal gate, a dog barking without much enthusiasm. These small, ordinary details grounded him. They reminded him that beneath all the noise of ambition and conflict, life was still happening at a human pace. Later that day, conversations unfolded naturally. Some were planned, others accidental. Philip had a way of making people feel seen without making them feel exposed. He asked questions, but never too many. He understood that people opened up when they didn't feel interrogated. Trust, once broken, was nearly impossible to rebuild. So he guarded it carefully. He thought often about loyalty, not as blind obedience, but as mutual respect. Loyalty demanded honesty, even when honesty was uncomfortable. Philip didn't surround himself with people who agreed with him all the time. He valued those who challenged him quietly, thoughtfully. Yes men were dangerous. They echoed your confidence but never your doubts. In the afternoon, he took time for himself. A walk, a pause. He believed reflection was a form of maintenance. Without it, the mind collected clutter. During these walks, he noticed changes others missed. New businesses opening, old ones fading away, faces growing older. Change was constant, but it didn't have to be threatening. Could be informative if you paid attention. He passed a group of young men laughing loudly, full of energy and certainty. For a moment, Philip saw his younger self in them. The hunger, the impatience. He hoped, silently, that they'd learn to temper ambition with judgment. Too much speed without direction often led to crashes. Evenings were for connection. Not networking, not strategizing, just connection. A shared meal. A familiar voice on the phone. Philip believed relationships needed tending like gardens. Neglect them and weeds grew quickly. He didn't measure friendships by usefulness, but by consistency. Who showed up when there was nothing to gain? Those were the bonds that lasted. There were times when the weight of history pressed on him. Stories remembered differently by different people. Events interpreted through biased lenses. Philip had made peace with the fact that not everyone would understand his choices. Explanation wasn't always possible, nor was it always necessary. Living with integrity mattered more than being universally understood. Late one evening, as rain tapped softly against the windows, Philip allowed himself a rare moment of vulnerability. He acknowledged the fear that came with responsibility, the fear of misjudging a situation, of trusting the wrong person, of missing something important. But he didn't dwell on it. Fear, he believed, was useful only when it informed caution, not paralysis. He reminded himself that control was often an illusion. You could plan meticulously and still be surprised. What mattered was how you responded when plans unraveled. Panic exposed weakness. Patience created opportunity. He had survived long enough to know the difference. As days turned into a steady rhythm, Philip focused on balance. Work and rest. Listening and speaking. Action and restraint. He didn't chase recognition. He didn't need validation. His satisfaction came from knowing he'd acted thoughtfully, even when outcomes weren't perfect. On one quiet night, he stood again by the window, watching the city breathe. He felt neither victorious nor defeated, just present. In that presence, there was clarity. The understanding that life wasn't about dramatic moments strung together, but about consistency in the spaces between them. Philip Testa continued forward, guided not by impulse, but by reflection. Not by noise, but by awareness. His story wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It moved steadily, shaped by patience, experience, and the quiet confidence of a man who understood that lasting influence rarely announced itself. It simply endured. Night draped itself over South Philadelphia with the slow certainty of someone who had all the time in the world. Philip Testa walked along familiar streets, each corner, lamppost, and doorway a small marker of memory. He moved deliberately, not because he had somewhere urgent to be, but because he understood that sometimes observation required stillness within motion. The city, alive yet subdued, offered lessons if one had the patience to notice them. Philip's mind wandered as he walked. He reflected on choices made in the past, not with regret, but with analysis. Every decision, every interaction, every moment of hesitation had built a framework around him. He understood that influence wasn't simply about power or presence. It was about understanding, timing, and the subtle art of reading people. Some men chased reputation like a trophy, flaunting it loudly and carelessly. Philip preferred to earn his quietly, letting respect accumulate through consistency rather than spectacle. The night seemed to amplify the quiet confidence that had always been his anchor. He remembered when he had first felt the weight of responsibility. It hadn't been sudden, but incremental, like water carving a path through stone. He had learned to navigate it, to hold it without letting it consume him, to shape it into a steadying force rather than a burdensome weight. This balance had become his signature. Passing by a small park, Philip paused to watch children playing under dim streetlights, their laughter faint but clear in the distance. He thought about legacy, not the kind told in headlines or gossip, but the kind woven into the lives of those around you. How do you touch lives in ways unseen but enduring? How do you teach lessons not through grand declarations but through example, patience, and quiet guidance? These questions had guided him more than ambition ever could. Back home, he reviewed his notes from the day, not plans for domination or conquest, but reflections on human behavior, lessons in negotiation, and small insights about how trust had shifted. Among friends and acquaintances, Philip had learned to notice subtleties. The way a tone could betray a thought, the pause that revealed hesitation, the choice of words that hinted at intention. Observation had always been his secret weapon. Evening calls came in, some urgent, some casual. Philip responded with careful attention, weighing every word before speaking. He had learned that a hasty comment, an unmeasured promise, or an idle dismissal could have consequences far beyond the moment. Influence was a currency, and carelessness was bankruptcy. Later, he sat alone in his study, a soft lamp casting shadows across the room. This was the hour when the city outside quieted enough to allow clarity inside. Philip considered alliances not as a list of names or a ledger of favors, but as living networks of trust and understanding. Relationships had depth. They had patterns, rhythms, and vulnerabilities. To understand them was to understand the machinery of influence itself. Philip thought about patience, a quality so rare that most men didn't recognize it until it was too late. Patience wasn't idleness, it was preparation. It was anticipation. It was seeing the shape of things before they were fully formed. In a world where impulsive decisions could undo years of careful work, patience was not a virtue but a survival tool. As he sipped his coffee late into the night, he pondered change. He had witnessed it repeatedly. New faces, new ambitions, new pressures. But he had learned that change, if understood, could be guided rather than resisted. Resistance led to conflict. Guidance led to adaptation. The men and women who thrived were those who respected the rhythm of change rather than trying to force it. Philip's thoughts eventually turned inward. He reflected on fear, not the kind that paralyzed, but the kind that informed. He acknowledged it, studied it, and used it as a measure of risk. He knew that life had its share of unpredictable elements, and that preparation didn't eliminate uncertainty, it only allowed one to respond with clarity and composure. The night stretched long and silent, the city pulsing faintly beneath the veneer of stillness. Philip felt a rare sense of peace. Not triumph, not resolution, but balance. Balance between observation and action, patience and decisiveness, vigilance and trust. It was in this quiet mastery of self and circumstance that he found his strength. By the early hours of the morning, Philip Testa rose once again with the city. The streets began to hum with the first stirrings of life, but he was already in motion. He moved with purpose, but not haste. His steps were measured, his thoughts deliberate, and his awareness keen. The city was unpredictable, but he had learned to navigate it with care. His story was one of subtle influence rather than flashy display. It was written in the spaces between moments, in the quiet exertion of judgment, and in the careful cultivation of trust. Philip understood that true strength rarely needed to announce itself. It simply endured, shaped by patience, foresight, and the deliberate choices of a man who had learned to balance life's constant uncertainties. As dawn broke fully over South Philadelphia, he paused briefly, looking over the rooftops and streets he had walked for decades. He understood that every day offered new tests, new decisions, and new opportunities to demonstrate the steadiness that had become his hallmark. He also knew that true mastery wasn't in controlling the world, but in mastering oneself. The morning light crept through the curtains, soft but insistent, signaling the start of another day in South Philadelphia. Philip Testa rose with the quiet discipline that had become second nature. Each day was a sequence of decisions, interactions, and observations, and he had long ago learned that starting with clarity and calm could set the tone for everything that followed. Breakfast was simple, unhurried, a few slices of toast and coffee strong enough to clear the mind without rattling nerves. Philip savored the small ritual. It grounded him, reminded him that even amidst responsibility, there were simple pleasures that required attention. These small routines acted like anchors, holding him steady when external pressures threatened to tip the balance. The neighborhood was stirring. Shopkeepers raised metal gates with the rhythmic clanging that marked the beginning of commerce. Children trudged sleepily toward school, backpacks bouncing, their chatter tentative in the early light. Philip noticed the small details, the angle of the morning sun, the way shadows fell on familiar walls, the subtle shifts in demeanor of people passing by. Observing these nuances had always been a cornerstone of his understanding of human behavior. Philip's day began with meetings, not formal boardroom affairs, but strategic conversations that demanded careful listening. Every word, tone, and hesitation held significance. He never rushed these exchanges. Patience was his instrument, precision his guide. He asked questions, probed gently, and allowed others to reveal their intentions in their own time. Most people revealed more in the pauses than in the speeches they prepared. A man approached, someone who had been around for years, though younger than Philip in age. He sought advice, guidance for a decision that could affect many lives. Philip didn't offer immediate solutions. Instead, he listened, reflecting on the dynamics involved, the unspoken pressures, the balance of loyalties and risks. Then he spoke, not with authority alone, but with measured insight, offering perspective rather than direct instruction. This approach had earned him respect that lasted longer than charisma or fear ever could. By midday, Philip had walked several blocks, shaking hands, exchanging nods, acknowledging people who had known him for decades. These moments, often overlooked by outsiders, were vital. They were small gestures, that reinforced trust and connection. They reminded others and himself that influence was built not on single grand actions, but on steady, consistent engagement. The afternoon brought reflection. He reviewed notes, mentally mapping relationships, potential challenges, and opportunities. Philip believed foresight was cultivated, not inherited. To anticipate outcomes, one had to understand motivations, patterns, and the subtleties of human interaction. Strategy, for him, was a quiet art, invisible to most, effective because it relied on understanding rather than intimidation. Evenings were quieter but no less deliberate. Philip sometimes met with close confidants, people whose opinions he valued not because they flattered him, but because they challenged him thoughtfully. He had learned early that true loyalty required honesty, and the best alliances were forged with those who didn't simply agree with you, but tested your ideas, prompting careful reconsideration and refinement. When the streets dimmed under the slow fall of night, Philip returned to private reflection. He considered the day's events, the small decisions that could have gone differently, the conversations that had revealed hidden intentions. His ability to process these things quietly, without dramatics, had kept him ahead of turmoil and conflict. Experience had taught him that calm observation often outweighed immediate reaction. Later, he sat by the window, watching the city pulse with distant movement. Cars passed. A lone pedestrian hurried along a sidewalk. Lights flickered in the buildings across the street. Philip felt the constant hum of life and the inevitability of change. He thought about the responsibilities that came with influence, how every choice, every action rippled outward. He had learned that leadership wasn't about control, but about guiding carefully, balancing patience with decisiveness. The night deepened, and Philip allowed himself moments of introspection. He reflected on fear, ambition, and the subtle pressures that shaped every interaction. These were not burdens but instruments of clarity. To ignore them was dangerous. To overreact to them was reckless. He had learned the fine balance of vigilance and restraint. As the hours stretched toward dawn, he prepared mentally for the next day. His influence was quiet, often unnoticed, but enduring. It was shaped by observation, careful judgment, and the understanding that true power rarely announced itself. Philip Testa moved through the world deliberately, aware that his legacy would not be forged by spectacle, but by the steadiness of his presence, the clarity of his decisions, and the patience with which he approached life's uncertainties. Night settled over South Philadelphia like a soft blanket, carrying with it a quiet that only seemed loud to those who truly listened. Philip Testa moved through his home with careful steps, every sound deliberate, every motion measured. He had learned that even the smallest detail could offer insight into larger truths. A door creaking, a distant voice, the rhythm of the city outside, all provided clues about timing, mood, and intention. Observation had always been his strongest tool, sharper than any show of force or influence. Sitting in his study, he pored over notes and letters, reflections rather than directives. Decisions weren't always immediate. Many were deliberated over hours, days, or even weeks. Philip understood that patience was not hesitation. It was strategy in its purest form. By allowing situations to unfold, he often learned more than he could through intervention. Sometimes, the natural course of events revealed the truth about people's motives better than any interrogation. Philip's attention to detail extended beyond interactions with people. He noticed patterns, behaviors, and subtleties that most overlooked. The way someone's expression shifted when confronted with certain words, the timing of a laugh, the rhythm of speech, these were the invisible threads that wove the fabric of human intention. Understanding these threads allowed him to navigate complex situations with quiet confidence. As the evening progressed, he received visitors. Not friends seeking favors, but those who needed counsel, insight, or a steady hand. Philip didn't speak to impress or intimidate. He spoke to clarify, to guide, and to illuminate paths that weren't immediately obvious. People left with answers, but also with questions they hadn't considered. This subtle approach reinforced trust and respect. Those who sought him out learned that influence was not exercised through domination, but through presence, observation, and discretion. Philip thought often about relationships, how fragile they could be, how resilient they could become if nurtured carefully. He had learned to read people not for exploitation, but for understanding. Knowing a person's priorities, fears, and aspirations allowed him to engage meaningfully, ensuring that alliances were built on mutual respect rather than transient convenience. Loyalty, in his view, was both earned and observed, not demanded. The streets outside had grown quiet, but the city's pulse never truly stopped. Philip could feel it through the windows, in the vibrations of distant traffic and the subtle echoes of life continuing elsewhere. He reflected on how life moved in cycles, moments of action and moments of stillness, each equally important. Reacting impulsively during stillness could undo careful preparation. Failing to act during movement could forfeit opportunity. Mastery, he realized, was understanding these rhythms and flowing with them, not forcing against them. Later, he revisited memories, not with nostalgia, but with clarity. Each memory was a lesson, each experience a teacher. He traced past decisions, analyzed outcomes, and measured how his judgment had evolved. Philip valued learning from reflection more than from instruction. The self-earned lesson was more enduring than any external advice. He also considered legacy, not in terms of fame or notoriety, but the lasting impressions left on people's lives, both directly and indirectly. The stories told about him were beyond his control, but the values he embodied, the patience he exercised, and the clarity with which he lived could influence more quietly but more persistently. He had learned that true impact often existed in subtlety, where the unobservant never saw it, but the careful, attentive observer recognized its presence. As midnight passed, Philip prepared for a brief walk. The streets, bathed in the silver light of street lamps, offered a sense of calm observation. Passing familiar buildings and silent alleys, he noticed how shadows moved differently from day to night, how textures changed with light, and how the city's rhythm shifted subtly when it believed itself alone. This walk was not leisure, it was strategy, reflection, and preparation. He thought about the men and women around him, their ambitions, loyalties, and unspoken fears. He understood that influence was maintained not through pressure, but through perception, and that perception could only be shaped carefully, consistently, and authentically. Missteps, even minor ones, could erode trust over time. Precision in words, in gestures, in decisions was crucial. By the time he returned home, the city had fallen into near-total silence. Philip took a moment to sit by the window, watching the night breathe, observing the interplay of light and shadow. In that stillness, he felt the weight of experience and the clarity that came with it. Power, influence, and legacy were not achieved through spectacle. They were cultivated through consistent, deliberate action and quiet mastery of self. Before sleep claimed him, Philip made a mental note of the coming day's priorities. Not crises, not conflicts, but attention to the small, pivotal moments that would ripple into larger consequences. His influence, steady and deliberate, was sustained by this careful preparation. It was the invisible hand guiding his world, not through domination, but through awareness, patience, and understanding. The city had settled into a rare kind of quiet, where even the hum of traffic seemed measured, deliberate, as if waiting for something to unfold. Philip Testa walked through South Philadelphia with the kind of presence that made even the familiar feel new. Each street, each corner, each shadow held subtle stories, if one knew how to read them. Observation had long been his most trusted companion. It revealed truths that words often obscured, and patience, he had learned, made those truths easier to discern. As the sun rose, casting muted gold across brick facades, Philip's mind drifted to the concept of influence. Not the brash, obvious kind, but the quiet, sustained influence that guided outcomes without announcing itself. To shape the course of events without being noticed required attentiveness, judgment, and a deep understanding of human nature. Philip had spent decades cultivating this skill. His reputation, grounded in respect and consistency, allowed him to navigate spaces where others stumbled. He passed familiar faces along the sidewalks, shopkeepers opening their stores, children heading to school, neighbors exchanging brief greetings. Each interaction, however fleeting, offered insight. Philip paid attention to patterns. Who lingered in conversation, who avoided eye contact, who seemed weighed down by invisible burdens. These small observations informed decisions far more reliably than confrontation or coercion ever could. The morning brought visitors seeking guidance. Philip listened more than he spoke, allowing them to articulate their concerns fully. He understood that people revealed their priorities and fears not through the loudest statements, but through subtle cues, the cadence of speech, the slight hesitation, the emphasis on certain words. When he finally responded, his words carried precision and weight, shaped not by impulse but by careful calculation. By afternoon, he was immersed in reflection. He reviewed relationships, alliances, and obligations, considering not only what had been accomplished but what was required for stability. Philip believed that trust was fragile yet enduring, built over repeated confirmations of reliability. Missteps, even small ones, could erode years of careful work. He approached every connection with this awareness, measuring actions and words against long-term consequences. Later, he walked through a quiet park, observing life moving in microcosm. A child learning to ride a bike, an elderly couple strolling arm in arm, a dog chasing its own shadow. The simplicity of these moments offered perspective. Amid the complexities of influence, loyalty, and strategy, Philip understood that grounding oneself in human experience, ordinary, observable, tangible, was essential. It reminded him that even the most intricate webs of power existed within the larger flow of life. Evening descended gradually, casting long shadows that stretched across familiar streets. Philip met with a close confidant, someone whose insight he valued not for flattery but for honest perspective. Their conversation flowed naturally, touching on challenges, potential shifts in alliances, and the subtle dynamics that governed their environment. Philip listened intently, interjecting with careful questions that revealed deeper truths without forcing disclosure. By nightfall, Philip reflected on patience once more. Patience, he realized, was not passive. It was active vigilance. It required observing developments, understanding motivations, and anticipating change without precipitating it. Most mistakes arose from haste or overconfidence. By allowing situations to evolve while maintaining readiness to act, he had cultivated an edge that few could match. He returned home to quiet contemplation. The city outside seemed to breathe with measured rhythm. Philip considered his own legacy, not in terms of recognition or fame, but in the enduring structures he had shaped through consistent judgment, careful alliances, and the cultivation of trust. Influence, he knew, persisted long after the loudest voices faded, sustained by precision, awareness, and the quiet confidence of measured action. Later, as he sat by the window, watching the interplay of light and shadow, Philip thought about balance. Between caution and risk, listening and speaking, action and restraint, there existed a space where mastery unfolded. Navigating life required understanding this equilibrium, adapting fluidly while maintaining principle. True influence, he concluded, was invisible to those who sought only spectacle. It was built in quiet, deliberate moments, unseen yet profoundly effective. As the night deepened, Philip allowed himself a rare smile of satisfaction. Not for triumph or acclaim, but for clarity in judgment, in observation, and in the delicate orchestration of human connection. The world would continue to turn, challenges would arise, and decisions would require precision. But he felt steady, grounded, and prepared, guided by the principles that had shaped his life and the enduring patience that had become his most reliable companion. The dawn was quiet, almost hesitant, as if the city itself was holding its breath. Philip Testa moved through South Philadelphia with the fluidity of someone who had known these streets for decades, yet never allowed familiarity to dull his attention. Each step, each glance, each gesture held weight. Nothing was wasted. He understood that life, like influence, was composed of countless small moments that built upon one another, creating a foundation far more enduring than any single dramatic act. Breakfast was simple, but deliberate, a moment of clarity before engagement with the day's complexities. Philip thought about timing, about how decisions made in haste often carried hidden consequences. He had seen it countless times. Men who acted on impulse, only to regret their choices in subtle but irreversible ways. Patience, observation, and measured action had become the instruments by which he navigated not only his personal affairs, but the networks of relationships that shaped his world. As he stepped into the streets, he noted the subtle cues of human behavior. The way a shopkeeper arranged goods, the pace of a man walking alone, the expressions of passers-by. Each observation added to a mental map, a framework for understanding how influence and trust intertwined. Philip had learned that the world moved in rhythms, and those who ignored them were inevitably caught unprepared. Mid-morning brought visits from confidants, people seeking guidance, reassurance, or perspective. Philip listened carefully, allowing them to speak fully before offering insight. His counsel was never rushed. It was deliberate, shaped by decades of observation and experience. Words were chosen with care, each one carrying nuance and precision. He understood that advice, like influence, was most powerful when it guided subtly rather than dictated openly. In the quiet hours of the afternoon, Philip reflected on legacy. Not the kind written in headlines or told in gossip, but the kind that endured in the choices made, the trust cultivated, and the respect earned over time. He thought about the balance between authority and empathy, strategy and patience. Leadership, he understood, was not about domination. It was about shaping circumstances with subtlety and insight, leaving an imprint that was felt more than seen. By evening, Philip engaged in careful review of his relationships and alliances. Every interaction, every commitment, every unspoken expectation was weighed. He knew that stability relied on understanding motivations and anticipating shifts in loyalties. The most enduring influence was rooted in trust, carefully nurtured and consistently demonstrated. Missteps could erode it, but steady, deliberate conduct could reinforce it across years. As night fell, he took a solitary walk through familiar neighborhoods. The streets were quiet, punctuated only by distant sounds of life. A dog barking, a car passing, the faint echo of footsteps. He moved slowly, observing, reflecting, and letting the calm of the city absorb him. In these moments, Philip found clarity. Decisions made in haste were dangerous. Those made with patience and insight endured. Returning home, he considered the day's events. The subtle cues, the interactions, the decisions, each had been a thread in the tapestry of influence he had spent decades weaving. He understood that real power was invisible to those seeking spectacle. It was the quiet, consistent, and deliberate exercise of judgment, the careful cultivation of trust, and the patient observation of human behavior that truly shaped outcomes. Before sleep claimed him, Philip allowed himself a moment of introspection. He thought about patience, clarity, and balance, the principles that had guided him through life. He recognized that influence and legacy were not products of flashy actions or displays of power, but of consistent, deliberate conduct over time. The city outside hummed softly, indifferent yet alive, carrying on in cycles of motion and stillness, challenge and opportunity. Philip Testa closed his eyes with a rare sense of calm. Not triumph, not victory, but clarity and readiness. The world would continue, and with it, the choices, the interactions, and the subtle exercises of influence that defined him. He understood that mastery was not about controlling the world, but about understanding it, responding with precision, and leaving a quiet, enduring imprint on the lives around him. And in that quiet understanding, in the balance of observation, patience, and deliberate action, Philip Testa found the essence of his life. Influence wielded with subtlety, legacy shaped by consistency, and a presence that endured beyond immediate recognition, quietly powerful and profoundly lasting. The first light of morning spilled over South Philadelphia, gentle and steady, revealing familiar streets in new hues. Philip Testa rose as he always did, with quiet discipline and deliberate focus. Each day carried the weight of both opportunity and responsibility, and he had long learned that preparation, attention, and calm observation were as essential as action. The world outside moved constantly, but he understood that patience often revealed more than urgency ever could. Breakfast was simple, but he took the time to savor it. A cup of coffee rich and dark, toast lightly buttered, moments that allowed his mind to settle before the day's engagements. Philip valued these routines. They were anchors amidst a life defined by constant navigation of human relationships, shifting loyalties, and delicate influence. In these quiet moments, he reflected on the choices that had brought him here, and those that would shape tomorrow. The morning's walk was purposeful yet unhurried. He greeted familiar faces along the way, not as an obligation, but as a recognition of the subtle bonds that sustained community. A nod, a smile, a brief exchange of words. Small gestures that reinforced trust and understanding. Philip knew that influence was built not in grand gestures, but in repeated, measured actions that quietly demonstrated reliability and attentiveness. By mid-morning, he met with close advisors, people whose perspectives he valued because they challenged as much as they informed. Philip listened with the patience of someone who had learned the value of observation. Each conversation was a chance to gauge intent, understand priorities, and anticipate challenges. His responses were measured, chosen to clarify rather than coerce, to illuminate paths rather than dictate directions. Through this careful guidance, he maintained both respect and loyalty. Afternoon brought reflection. Philip revisited ongoing situations, considering relationships, obligations, and the potential outcomes of various decisions. He understood that influence was delicate. It required balance between assertiveness and restraint, between immediate reaction and long-term strategy. Missteps could ripple unpredictably, and success was rarely determined by a single choice, but by the accumulation of consistent, thoughtful decisions. As the day progressed, Philip's observations extended beyond personal interactions to the rhythms of the city itself. He noticed the flow of people, the subtle shifts in behavior, the ebb and surge of daily life. The patterns of movement, conversation, and interaction offered insight into the larger dynamics at play. He understood that life, like influence, had cycles, moments for action, moments for reflection, and moments where patience was the most effective tool. Evening approached, bringing a softer light and slower pace. Philip met with another confidant, discussing future considerations and potential alliances. These meetings were never about dominance. They were about alignment, understanding, and shared insight. Decisions were weighed, consequences projected, and the subtleties of human intention considered with care. Philip had long known that the people around him were not just participants but indicators, and that their behavior revealed opportunities and risks alike. By nightfall, Philip walked through quiet streets, the air carrying the distant sounds of life. Occasional footsteps, a far-off car, the gentle murmur of voices. These walks were moments of observation and reflection, moments where he could process the day's interactions and anticipate the days ahead. The calm allowed him to step outside the immediacy of events and view them with clarity, understanding not only what was happening but why it was happening. Returning home, he settled into contemplation, reviewing the day's insights and considering strategies for the future. Philip knew that true influence was invisible to those seeking spectacle. It was not in grand declarations or displays of power, but in careful listening, steady judgment, and consistent action over time. These qualities, practiced with patience and mindfulness, created impact far more enduring than any momentary show of authority. Before sleep claimed him, Philip reflected on balance, on the careful navigation of human relationships, and on the subtle orchestration of influence. He understood that his life's work was built on observation, patience, and the thoughtful exercise of judgment. Every decision, interaction, and reflection contributed to a legacy defined not by recognition or fear, but by steady, enduring influence. In that quiet, Philip felt a sense of calm clarity. His presence, subtle yet powerful, was guided by understanding, foresight, and patience. Influence and legacy, he realized, were cultivated in the unnoticed moments, in deliberate choices, and in the quiet mastery of self and circumstance. The night embraced him with a sense of completeness, knowing that his careful attention to the world around him had shaped it in ways unseen but enduring. The city was quiet now, draped in the soft shadow of night, and Philip Testa sat alone in his study, reflecting on the journey that had brought him to this point. Years of observation, careful decision-making, and patient engagement had shaped a life defined not by noise or spectacle, but by the quiet exercise of judgment. He understood that true influence was invisible to the casual observer. It was measured in the trust cultivated, the relationship sustained, and the subtle guidance that directed outcomes without fanfare. Philip considered the people whose lives intersected with his own, the confidants, the advisors, the neighbors, the community. Each had contributed to a web of interactions that required constant attention. He had learned that influence was a living thing, delicate and resilient at once, shaped by consistency and attentiveness. Missteps could be costly, but steady, measured action allowed trust and respect to grow quietly over time. As the night deepened, he thought about the lessons of patience. Impulsivity and haste had derailed countless others who lacked the ability to observe, reflect, and respond with care. Philip had learned early that waiting, watching, and understanding often revealed solutions that action alone could never achieve. The world unfolded in rhythms, and those who could navigate them with clarity and foresight endured beyond fleeting moments of success. He also reflected on the subtle power of perception. People often judged the visible, but it was the unseen, the steady presence, the quiet judgment, the thoughtfulness behind decisions that held the most sway. Philip had cultivated this form of influence deliberately, knowing that the impressions left by consistent, careful conduct endured longer than any display of dominance. True authority, he understood, was exercised with discretion, earning respect through reliability rather than fear. The memories of past challenges surfaced, not with regret, but with clarity. Each choice, each decision, each interaction had been a thread in the tapestry of his life. He recognized how patience, observation, and consistent judgment had allowed him to navigate the complexities of his world. Lessons learned through experience were the ones that endured, and Philip carried them with quiet confidence, aware that they shaped not only his path but the lives of those around him. As the hours passed, he considered the concept of legacy. Not the kind chronicled in stories or headlines, but the subtle, enduring impact of steady guidance, thoughtful decisions, and careful stewardship of relationships. Influence exercised with awareness created ripples that extended far beyond immediate circumstances, shaping lives, communities, and even the culture of the environment itself. Philip understood that this form of legacy was profound precisely because it was largely invisible, felt rather than seen. He allowed himself a final moment of reflection before sleep. The lessons of his life were clear. Observe deeply, act with purpose, cultivate trust, and exercise patience. Power was not in dominance, but in understanding. Success was not in spectacle, but in consistency. In these quiet truths, Philip found the essence of his life's work, the art of guiding without forcing, influencing without demanding, and shaping outcomes through discernment rather than imposition. As he lay down, he felt the calm certainty that comes from a life lived deliberately. The streets outside were silent, but they carried the echoes of countless interactions, moments, and choices. Philip Testa had navigated them with care, clarity, and quiet mastery. His presence, subtle yet enduring, had shaped the world around him in ways that would persist far beyond immediate recognition. And in that quiet night, with the city resting beneath the weight of history and the pulse of life continuing, Philip Testa's story closed, not with spectacle, drama, or fanfare, but with the lasting imprint of thoughtful presence, steady judgment, and the subtle, enduring power of influence.